At 2:47 a.m., the phone rang on Shawn Pomrenke's boat in the middle of the Bering Sea. Shah wasn't asleep. Miners who spend years studying the ground develop a strange instinct. When something unusual is happening beneath the surface, they often feel it long before anyone proves it. That quiet feeling had kept Shah awake most of the night. The call came from his dive supervisor. 40 feet below the freezing pitch-black water, one of Shah's divers had suddenly stopped working. His sweep pattern across the sea floor had ended right in the middle of the area they were dredging. Not because of equipment failure, not because of danger, because the ground had changed. Instead of the normal scattered flakes miners expect in the Bering Sea, the sediment beneath his nozzle was unusually dense. The diver immediately realized something wasn't normal. After 11 years diving for offshore gold, he had never seen a deposit like this. "Hold your position," the supervisor told him over the radio. Then he called Shah. "You should come see this yourself." Shah didn't hesitate. Growing up in Nome, Alaska, he had spent his life learning how the ocean hides gold, watching currents move sediment, and studying patterns most miners miss. But even he wasn't prepared for what his diver had just discovered. Because what lay beneath that patch of sea floor wasn't just a rich spot. It was a rare geological anomaly, a place where natural forces had concentrated gold over millions of years. By the end of the season, that single stretch of ground would produce over $120 million in gold. But before we continue, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, because what Shawn Pomrenke's crew uncovered that night would become one of the most unbelievable discoveries ever made in the Bering Sea. Shawn Pomrenke didn't choose the Bering Sea. In many ways, the Bering Sea chose him long before he was old enough to make that decision. His father, Steve Pomrenke, built the family's mining operation in Nome through a mix of stubborn determination and raw courage, the exact qualities needed to survive in one of the harshest mining environments on the planet. Steve wasn't an academic geologist. He didn't arrive with engineering degrees or scientific credentials. He was the kind of miner who learned by doing. Every failure became information. Every mistake was another lesson about how the sea behaved. And through persistence alone, he managed to build a real operation in waters that defeat most people who try to work them. Growing up inside that world gave Shah something no classroom could ever teach: instinct. Season after season, he learned how the Bering Sea communicated its secrets, the way coastal people learn to read weather, not just from instruments, but from subtle signals in the sky, the waves, and the shifting sand below. He learned to recognize promising ground in the gravel running through a sluice. More importantly, he learned to sense when rich ground was approaching before it even appeared. Small details mattered: changes in sediment texture, shifts in particle size, the way the seafloor reacted to the suction dredge. Experienced operators could read those signals almost like written language. But along with those skills, Shah inherited something else: the Pomrenke reputation. In a tight-knit town like Nome, reputation carries serious weight. It opens doors, but it also creates expectations. Being Steve Pomrenke's son meant people assumed Shah would run the operation exactly the same way his father had. Same instincts, same methods, same strategies that had built the family name over decades. When Shah started experimenting with different approaches, people noticed. In small professional communities, innovation often creates friction, especially when it challenges traditions that have worked for years. But Shah pushed forward anyway. Not because he dismissed what his father had built. In fact, it was the opposite. He respected that legacy enough to realize the next phase required something new. The ground Steve had mined so successfully was slowly producing less. The deposits were still there, but the returns were shrinking. Shah believed the Bering Sea still had more to offer. You just had to search for it differently. "My dad created something incredible," Shah explained in an early interview. "I'm not trying to replace what he built. I'm trying to expand it. And expansion requires change. You don't extend a legacy by repeating the exact same steps forever. You extend it by discovering what earlier methods overlooked." That philosophy guided Shah for years as he balanced tradition with innovation. In many ways, he was mining the Bering Sea exactly how his father taught him. But at the same time, he was mining it in ways his father had never attempted. Both things were true, and the ground that eventually produced $120 million in gold. It was ground the old approach had never touched. Every experienced Bering Sea miner understands the basics. Rule: gold collects in predictable places, near creek mouths, along exposed bedrock, in zones where ocean currents naturally deposit heavy material. Those geological patterns have been studied for decades. They're well understood. So well understood, in fact, that the most promising ground around Nome had already been mined again and again for more than 100 years. The obvious spots still produced gold, but the numbers were shrinking. Veteran miners who had worked these waters the longest were seeing the results of heavily exploited deposits, still profitable, but nowhere near the kind of discovery that changes everything. Shah had been watching that trend for years, and eventually he started asking a question that most miners weren't asking anymore, because to them, the answer seemed obvious. If the obvious ground was slowly running out, then the real question became simple. Where was the ground no one had thought to search? Most miners believed the answer was straightforward. There wasn't any. The offshore deposits in the Bering Sea around Nome had already been studied extensively. What remained, many assumed, was simply the leftover production from formations everyone already understood. But Shah wasn't convinced. Not because he had proof the common belief was wrong, at least not in the beginning. What kept bothering him was a small but important flaw in the logic. Nearly all the information about the Bering Sea's offshore gold came from surface-level exploration. For over a century, mining operations had focused mostly on the top 20 to 30 feet of sea floor. That depth range was the limit of what traditional offshore equipment could reach economically. Anything deeper than about 35 or 40 feet had only been sampled occasionally and never examined in a systematic way. During a planning meeting with his crew, Shah explained the idea in a way that stuck with everyone in the room. "We think we understand this sea floor because we've mined a lot of it," he said. "But really, we've only mined the top layer. It's like reading the first 2 chapters of a book and assuming you know the whole story." The geological reasoning behind going deeper was actually simple. Placer gold tends to gather where ancient rivers once slowed down and dropped heavy sediment. The modern Bering Sea floor is relatively young in geological terms. Less than 20,000 years ago, the Bering Land Bridge connected Asia and North America as dry land. Back then, rivers flowed across terrain that now lies underwater. Beneath today's sea floor sediment are layers formed during those ancient landscapes, places where gold could have concentrated long before the ocean covered them. In other words, the modern seabed might only be hiding part of the story. No one around Nome had seriously searched for those deeper, older deposits. Not because the idea was flawed, but because reaching them required equipment that could work far deeper than standard Bering Sea mining systems, and building that capability would cost a lot of money. For decades, it had simply been easier to keep working the shallow ground everyone already understood. Shaw decided to take the risk anyway. Mining consistently at depths between 38 and 45 feet in the Bering Sea isn't just a bigger version of shallow water dredging. It's an entirely different engineering challenge. Water pressure increases. Visibility for divers drops dramatically. Equipment experiences far more mechanical strain. And the Bering Sea itself leaves very little room for mistakes. Weather windows are short. Storms can build quickly. And if heavy mining gear is deployed at depth when conditions suddenly worsen, the consequences can be both expensive and dangerous. Shaw spent 2 off-seasons preparing for that reality. He didn't just study it on paper. He broke down every practical problem involved in operating at deeper depths. He analyzed the exact ways conventional equipment failed when pushed beyond its limits. Then he worked with manufacturers to redesign systems that worked reliably at 25 feet, but struggled at 40. The dredge systems were modified. Surface vessels were upgraded. Backup systems and safety redundancies were added. Divers trained under new safety protocols designed specifically for deeper operations. By the time the next season approached, Shaw had invested heavily. New dredging hardware, stronger support equipment, additional safety systems, and a crew trained for a very different type of operation. Standing in front of them before the season started, Shaw made one thing clear. "This isn't the same operation we've been running," he said. "Different depths, different equipment, different procedures." Then he paused. "The margin for cutting corners is smaller than you're used to. We do this the right way, or we don't do it at all." Shaw's father, Steve, observed the preparation quietly. There was a particular look in his eyes, the look of someone who had built something with his own hands and was now watching it evolve into something new. Steve understood big investments. Over the years, he had taken plenty of risks himself. Some had paid off, others hadn't. He could see the logic behind Shaw's plan, but he also understood the danger. "What happens if the deep ground isn't there?" Steve asked one evening. Shaw didn't hesitate. "Then we've built the ability to mine deeper water anywhere we want," he replied. "The equipment and the experience don't disappear if the first location doesn't work." Then he added one more sentence. "But I think it will work. The geology makes sense." Steve nodded slowly. He didn't say he fully agreed, but he didn't try to stop the plan either. For Shaw, that quiet neutrality, no criticism, no resistance, was close enough to approval. So he kept moving forward. When the new mining season finally began, Shaw lowered his redesigned operation into the Bering Sea for the first real test. The equipment held together. The crew followed the new procedures smoothly. The dredge systems operated at depth without the breakdowns earlier tests had warned about. Shaw's first target area had been chosen based on his analysis of where ancient river channels might exist beneath the modern seabed. The early results were encouraging, but not spectacular. The returns confirmed the system worked. The approach made sense, but they weren't nearly big enough to justify the scale of the investment. Still, Shaw stayed with the plan. And then came the call. The section of seafloor that Shaw's diver discovered at 2:47 in the morning wasn't even on the primary target list. It sat just outside an area the crew had been mining for about 3 weeks. Sweeping the nearby ground wasn't part of a grand strategy. It was simply common practice. Experienced miners always check the edges of productive areas. Rich ground often has rich neighbors. Shaw's diver was running a routine sweep pattern across that adjacent zone. Nothing special. Just the steady, methodical expansion of work into nearby territory, until suddenly everything changed. The sediment beneath his equipment shifted. Normally, geological changes happen gradually, one formation blending slowly into another. This transition wasn't gradual, it was abrupt, and the material coming through the dredge immediately felt different. In 11 years working the Bering Sea, the diver had developed a deep instinct for the seabed. But this was new. The gold particles looked wrong in the best possible way. They were larger and rougher than they should have been for that location. And their shape suggested something important. They hadn't traveled far. These weren't tiny grains carried long distances by currents. They were close to their original source. The diver froze. He studied the material coming up through the dredge, and then, ignoring every instinct that tells a miner to keep working when the ground turns rich, he reached for his communication system. That was the message sent to the surface. When Shah arrived and examined the material the diver had recovered, his reaction wasn't dramatic. Instead, he went completely quiet. For several minutes, he studied the samples and the readings, saying nothing. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected, but the crew understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't hesitation. It was the focused thinking of someone who had spent years imagining a geological pattern like this, and was now seeing proof of it for the first time. Shah was mentally aligning theory with reality. Only after he was certain did he finally speak. "Mark the boundaries," he said calmly. "I want a full perimeter sweep before we move anything." Then he added another instruction. "And nobody talks about this until I know exactly what we're dealing with." The boundary sweep lasted 4 days. 4 days of slow, careful surveying, while Shah resisted the urge, an urge every miner understands, to immediately start extracting the richest ground they had ever encountered. The pressure wasn't coming from the crew. They trusted his judgment. The pressure came from inside. But Shah knew rushing would be a mistake. Mapping the entire concentration zone first wasn't just caution, it was strategy. If miners attacked the center of a deposit too soon, they risked damaging the richest edges and reducing total recovery. The smartest approach is always the same. Map everything first. Design the plan second. Mine in the order the plan demands. When the survey was finally complete, the results were staggering. The deposit stretched roughly 340 feet at its longest point, far larger than the initial discovery suggested. Even more important was the geological signature. The abrupt sediment transition the diver first noticed along the southwest edge appeared across most of the perimeter. That confirmed something critical. This wasn't random rich ground. It was a distinct ancient concentration zone. A deposit formed in a specific geological event long ago, exactly the kind Shah's theory predicted. After reviewing the full data set, he gathered the crew. "This is what I've been looking for," he told them. "Not this exact spot, but this kind of formation." He pointed to the mapped boundaries. Ancient concentration, clear edges, almost no disturbance after it formed. Then he nodded slowly. "This is the real thing." Shah spent the entire night designing the extraction sequence. Every line of data from the survey was analyzed. Every section of the zone had to be approached in the right order. The decisions he made during those hours would determine how much of the deposit his operation could actually recover. The mining run that followed lasted 78 days, and from the very beginning, the crew noticed something different in Shah. He wasn't stressed, he wasn't frantic, but he was operating with a level of sustained focus they had never seen before. Equipment inspections became relentless. Maintenance delays were unacceptable. Weather windows were used to their absolute limit. Downtime was reduced to only what was unavoidable. Crew rotations were carefully managed to prevent fatigue from creeping into the operation. One crew member later described it simply. Shah ran that season like he knew it was the most important one he'd ever have. Because it was, and everyone working with him understood that. The daily gold cleanups were impressive from the very beginning. Within 2 weeks, those extraordinary numbers had become the normal baseline. The deposit proved remarkably consistent. Not perfectly uniform, but rich across nearly the entire mapped area, the way authentic ancient placer deposits usually are. The variations they saw matched ancient sediment flow patterns rather than the unpredictable patchiness of weaker formations. By week 6, Shah had already broken his own personal production record. By week 10, the operation had surpassed any season his vessel had ever achieved. And by the time the 78-day extraction run ended, the numbers were so large that Nome's mining community would spend the entire winter trying to process what had happened. Shah didn't immediately announce the results. He had seen what happened when miners rushed their numbers into public view, only to revise them later when the real accounting came in. He wasn't interested in that kind of attention. Instead, he waited. The final verification process took 3 weeks. Gold weights were confirmed. Assay reports were completed. Operational costs were calculated. Deepwater mining isn't cheap. Fuel, equipment wear, crew salaries, and maintenance all add up quickly. Only after everything was finalized did the numbers become clear. Gross recovery value, $127 million. Net production value after costs, $120 million. Shah looked at the final figure quietly. Not dramatically, not for show. Just the careful observation of someone filing the result into the mental record that guides future decisions. Then he picked up the phone and called his father. Steve Pomrenke answered the way experienced fathers answer calls from sons working in the field, alert, attentive, ready for whatever news might come. Shah told him the number. For a moment, there was no reply. Not complete silence, just the subtle pause of someone trying to process what they'd just heard. "Say that again," Steve finally said. Shah repeated it. Another pause. "That's not possible," Steve said. "The accounting says it is," Shah replied. Steve had spent decades mining the Bering Sea. He had a clear mental model of what those waters could produce, built from a lifetime of experience. The number Shah had just given him didn't fit inside that model. Finally, Steve spoke again. "The deep ground." It wasn't a question. It was recognition. "The deep ground," Shah confirmed. The silence that followed said more than words could. A father who had built the foundation of an operation, and a son who had taken that foundation somewhere the builder himself never imagined it could go. In family businesses, moments like that carry a special kind of meaning. One generation starts something. And if you enjoy stories about incredible discoveries like this, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, because the next find might be even more unbelievable.